Welcome back. It's been a most exhilarating week since I put out that first rather tentative podcast, and I've had responses from all over the world. The first actually came in from Madrid, from Katie Dardigan, and it just shows the huge diaspora that has happened from all of us who just love that land between the Limpopo and the Zambezi. In fact, somebody else wrote, Bev Seymour, and she said, I was interested in what you said about Mzilikazi coming from Mozambique. I didn't know he came from Mozambique. Well, he sort of did and he didn't, as I explained to Bev. So let's start by looking at King Mzilikazi. Who was he? Well, he was a prince of the very small clan at that time called Khumalo. It's a name we know very well now. His father was Chief Machobana, who married the daughter of King Zwide of the Ndwandwe people, and they lived up in the Mfolozi River area, which we probably know better today as Hluhluwe, around the Hluhluwe Game Reserve. So well up in that Natal Zululand area, almost up to Richards Bay, in fact. So it was very far north, and they were just building themselves enough of a tribe to be self-sufficient and hopefully fend off all comers. Not when one of those comers was King Tshaka. And he started to harass the Ndwandwe people. He beat them time and time again until there were just a very few of them left. One of them was Mzilikazi. So he said, right, we can't go on like this, otherwise we're no longer going to exist. So he got 10 of his best, most physical men. They went and they waited outside King Tshaka's capital to see him. King Tshaka didn't want to see them. He was actually a very private man and somebody who didn't trust anybody else in case they were going to try and take his throne from him. Everybody started watching as Mzilikazi and his men went through extraordinary exercises for a month of tolerance, of courage, resilience, athleticism. Everybody was watching, including Tshaka's mother. And she went to him one day and said, there's a young man out there who I think is the closest one I've ever seen, who is like you. I think he should become your chief lieutenant. And King Tshaka listened to her. And so, Matabele people, you have a lot to thank King Tshaka's mother for, because if she hadn't said that, Mzilikazi probably would not have lasted another day. So in he went, and he started to learn all these extraordinary military strategies which Tshaka had become famous for. Gradually he became Tshaka's head induna, and over the next few years he increased that Zulu tribe magnificently, the two of them working together. We've all heard of just how the Zulus did fight and how they worked together in that military way, but it's always been a little bit academic and a bit technical. So when I was writing my book, one of my characters is Jabu, who is himself the son of a chief, and he's based upon a real person. My book is based upon real events, as near as I could decipher them from all the rubbish that is out there, with everybody saying to writing home to mother in Norfolk to say what a hero he'd been, to the same incident being reported by somebody who was trying to make sure he would be the next Prime Minister of the Cape. Each of them vested interests, each of them really hard to find that thread of truth in amongst them. But the threads of truth about the Zulu military might were very real indeed. So within that fiction, I thought I would take Jabu and say, okay, this young man is going to be somebody when he's a leader. How do we start to form the difference? Decided to do a Zulu initiation, a Zulu circumcision, which actually Tshaka had banned 200 years before, although there is a bit of a push to reinstate that now. So in going through all of that, which was a dreadful process, incredibly painful, and always followed by a month of healing, during which time they would often be in a slightly semi-conscious state. Aha, what an opportunity to describe that Zulu way of military might and how they actually conquered all these hundreds of tribes right running through all that Natal area by describing the Zulu war through Jabu's eyes. In order to do that, I'm going to have to put my glasses on. Jabu loved and learned the stories of the great Zulu king Tshaka. His eyes were fixed on the lightning of the day as his imagination pictured the oil-shined bodies of warriors sweating with the excitement of preparation for battle. The king needed cattle, and he had thrown the spear at the Intwala so that warriors would blunt their spears against a troublesome tribe. He imagined the brave shouts of the Amabuto as they told each other, "Never fear pain, die with courage, and the enemy will fall as water at our feet." He imagined the battle itself, the silence of the creeping, as the Amabuto moved imperceptibly closer to the enemy in the blackness of the night, with their backs to the mark where the scouts had told them the sun would rise. They would creep and stop, and creep and stop. Not too close, never too close. The first creeping was made up of the new Mashoja. Once they were enemies who were hated, then they became slaves. When they were loyal and proved they were brave enough, they became Mashoja, or Amacha Amazulu, fighters of the Zulu people. While the enemy slept, it was time for the second creeping to come up. This time, the trusted warriors, the Impi. Even in the dark, their oiled bodies gleamed against the featureless bush. Then the kneeling, with no sound, no moving, until the sky behind them washed with early morning red. As they knelt, the strong runners circled up and round behind the enemy to form the Ipondo Zinkomo, the horns of the bull running on noiseless feet. Then the silence. Last of all, the backward legs forming into place, the Amadoda Impi, looking back and to the sides, keeping their eyes wide open for enemy attacking from behind. The Mfans were hidden with them, ready to take long shields and ikwa to the warriors when they needed them. As the red streaked across the sky and just before the sun leapt up bright behind them, he imagined the slow half-standing of the first creeping, with shields turned sideways, still in absolute silence, silence for as long as a big pot took to boil on a wood fire. Then the zhee, the shh, the shh, the hissing. Jabu's body ached and thrilled to the fear of the zhee. The enemy, hearing and understanding, running all over, like frightened ants when their nest is disturbed by a big foot. The Zulu would hear shouts of "Amazulu! Amazulu!" The awful, inescapable zhee, until the horns were in place. The frightened ants running this way, then that way, looking, running again. The zhee, louder and louder. Then the king shouts. The first creaking crack their shields flat in front of them with a loud noise, their ikwa in the other hand, moving slow, steady, strong, now bending, so the enemy can see the second creeping behind as they stand up tall and roar and leap and gyrate and scream, their ostrich feathers making them giants in the early morning. Jabu's imagination was filled with the sights and sounds of the battle. The ants flee into impi horns on the one side, then on the other side. The spears grow red. Above the screams and roars he hears the squelch of ikwa as the warriors pull them from the weak and the dying. Jabu's head sank between his knees. He felt exhausted by the intensity of the imagined battle. After a few moments, and as the images faded from his mind, he remembered the Zulu rules. Strong fighters were tied together, and a chosen clan would be herded to the Zulu place for punishment. All young children were killed or left behind for wild animals. Women were chosen for strength and beauty. Those still suckling were allowed to take their babies with them. Old men and women went too. It was tradition to bring blessing to them for wisdom and kindness. Nobody was ever left alive to fight the Zulu in vengeance. So it was a disciplined, extraordinary, strategic performance. Mzilikazi learnt well. He helped Tshaka build that Zulu nation to the most incredible proportions. And one day he said, and why am I doing this for somebody else when I could be doing it for me? So he neglected to send back the spoils of the latest battle to King Tshaka, the cattle. King Tshaka was very cross. He couldn't believe it at first. And then he was so angry. And he set off after Mzilikazi. They fought 3 fierce wars, and each time Mzilikazi was beaten. So he escaped with his ragtag bobtail crowd that were left, back to where he knew best, which was that Black Mfolozi River, and a little bit further up to what we would now know as the border of southern Mozambique, round about Maputo. And there he and his warriors healed their wounds until they were fit enough themselves to start trekking out, make sure that they could get through that spare area between the Kruger and Swaziland at the top there. So he was battered, bashed, and didn't look as though he was actually going to get anywhere. But of course he did, because he was a man of great substance. He set through that northern Transvaal area, and the Mfekani, as it became known, was the time of the greatest massacre of other tribes in that whole area, as Mzilikazi built them up from about 1800 originally to 20,000 before he eventually crossed the Limpopo. Those figures as near as one can possibly get from all the options that you're offered. While he was doing all of these killings and things going on, he heard of a rather interesting man by the name of Robert Moffat. He didn't know who he was, but he'd heard some very strange things about him. Now, Moffat was a missionary sent out there by the London Missionary Society. And one of the excellent things about those missionaries was they had to report every week back to the LMS. And they didn't really have an axe to grind. They were only accountable to God. So they told it as it was, as they saw it. And some of Moffat's writings particularly were fascinating, absolutely fascinating. There's just one little story that would throw a bit more light on Mzilikazi. So Mzilikazi, to try and find out about him, sent 2 headmen to the mission at Khumalo, instructing them to be his eyes, his ears, and his mouth. Mrs. Moffat fed them generously, as she did to all visitors at that time, of course, but she did it with one difference. She offered the naked warriors some clothes to make sure that the missionary eye was not offended. They wanted to know, of course, these warriors, these 2 headmen, what magic made the forge and its furnaces work all the time on fire. They went to church, but were very disappointed that they ended up not singing battle and war songs. Most of all, they wanted to understand the moving houses, the wagons. Then one day when they were in the wagons and pointing and trying to find out what it was, prodding things, they saw a mirror. Oh, there was somebody behind that mirror. That was to be left well alone. Ukutakati. So they were ready to leave. But they asked Moffat to go with them for the first part of the journey, because there were apparently some hostile Tswana tribes around. Well, after much prayer, and you can imagine how much prayer, one white man going into Matabele territory, that was not an easy decision to make. But the Moffats decided he must go. He refused to take any weapons with him. He just took his very faithful 2 Tswana drivers to lead the oxen and the wagon. And off he went. His diary records, "Evidence is on every hand of the terrible Matabeles. In places where populous towns and villages had been, nothing remained but dilapidated walls and heaps of stone mingled with human skulls. The country had become the abode of reptiles and beasts of prey, the inhabitants having perished beneath the spears and clubs of their savage enemies." Seeing village after village destroyed confirmed to Moffat and his 2 Tswana drivers just how savage the Matabele were. As they entered his capital, King Mzilikazi watched in astonishment as the wagon approached. We proceeded directly into the town, and on riding into the centre of a large fold, we were rather taken by surprise to find it lined by 800 warriors, besides 200 who were concealed on each side of the entrance as if in ambush. We were beckoned to dismount, which we did, holding our horses' bridles in our hands. They then joined the circle, falling into rank with as much order as if they had been accustomed to European tactics. Then all was silent, and Mzilikazi marched out from behind the lines with an interpreter and with attendants following bearing meat, beer, and other food. He gave us a hearty salutation and seemed overjoyed. Moffat recorded some of the questions that Mzilikazi asked when they spent time together. "Is the wagon a living creature? How do the little front wheels keep up with the big back wheels? How does the iron tie around the wheel in one piece without end or joints?" Apparently Umbate, one of the Indunas who'd visited the mission, couldn't contain himself and explained, pointing at Moffat's hand, "My eyes saw that very hand cut the bars of iron, take a piece from one end and join them, as you see it now." "Did he give medicine to the iron?" the king asked. "No," said Umbate, "nothing but fire and hammer." From time to time, young men would approach them in a crouching position, speaking and shouting out praise to the king. At other times, they would send up a massive shout, "Allow us to go to X or Y, and wash our spears in blood." Having listened very courteously to Moffat's advice on practicing peace and love at all times, the missionary's records indicate that Mzilikazi turned and smiled at him. "My people want to make war." After nearly 2 months away, and with his wagon loaded up with presents and massive amounts of food, Moffat prepared to return to Kuruman. But Mzilikazi insisted on accompanying him. Turning to Moffat's reports again, Mzilikazi found it convenient to lay his well-lubricated body down on my bed to take a nap, and on awakening invited me to lie beside him. "My goodness, what did he do?" Carol asked. Moffat wrote, "I begged to be excused." So, what an interesting time it was. Moffat and Mzilikazi remained friends until Mzilikazi died. When Moffat eventually went to visit him in what was then Matabele land, the king was in a very bad way, but Moffat was able to relieve some symptoms with some of his medical knowledge, and in fact the two of them went off together by ox-wagon to look for David Livingstone. Little bits, I hope you picked up bits and pieces that you didn't know. Mzilikazi was heading for the Limpopo. He knew it wasn't the right river for him, and he needed to get to the Zambezi. But that's a story we'll say next week. I do hope you've enjoyed it, and I do hope you'll join me again, and please contact me through my website, www.jillbakerauthor.com, and I would love to hear from you hear your ideas. If there's something you heard that you didn't think was quite right, let's talk about it. I'd love to know it. And thank you for joining me.